Hi, this is Cheryl Gallant, your re-elected Member of Parliament for the vibrantly foliaged riding of Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke. Now, before we begin, I wish to extend my thanks again to the voters of Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke who placed their trust in me. Thank you to all the election workers and volunteers from all campaigns who contributed to the exercise in democracy. Speaking of democracy, let's begin with the biggest threat to our democracy, Justin Trudeau and his liberal media allies. Just before the election, Trudeau and his heritage minister unveiled the next step in their campaign to control what Canadians can see and hear online. The first step was Bill C-10. That was the law to regulate the content of broadcasters on the internet. Among the restrictions was the aspect of deeming all individuals who upload content to be broadcasters. Their next step was Bill C-36, the so-called Online Harms Bill. Despite having already introduced the bill, the Liberals then announced they were holding consultations on the new regulations to censor the internet. The Liberals are proposing to create a new federal bureaucracy to censor the internet. This bureaucracy would be given the power to block websites and issue massive fines to social media companies that do not act quickly enough to remove harmful content. How will social media companies know the content is harmful? They won't. They can't. 500 hours of videos are uploaded to the YouTube every minute. It's not possible to have enough people to review all the videos, so it will be done by computers using algorithms. Since the companies do not wish to be fined, they'll err on the side of caution. Facebook and YouTube will take down anything which could be labeled by anyone as harmful. This is government-mandated censorship. It's wrong, and Canadians from across the political spectrum are speaking out. Thanks to Ottawa University professor Michael Geist, Canadians can now see for themselves what submissions the government has received during their consultations. Professor Geist has provided links to these reports because he does not believe the government will share them with the public. I would like to share just a few sentences from these reports so you have any idea of the intensity with which these groups oppose the Liberal plan to censor the internet. Access Now is an international human rights organization that defends and extends the digital rights of people at risk across the globe. Here's what they wrote to the government. Quote, Access Now argues the government should reconsider the scope of vague definitions and overly broad categories of harmful content. Provide adequate time frames for content removal. Avoid imposing proactive monitoring or filtering obligations. Make fines and other sanctions proportionate and refrain from mandating overly broad website blocking at the internet service provider level. End of quote. Canadian Association of Research Libraries took a conciliatory tone while still disapproving. They wrote, quote, Canadian research libraries support the assertion in the discussion guide that Canadian citizens deserve a safe, inclusive, and open online environment, but we have concerns that the proposed approach may do more harm than good in many instances. End quote. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association was more direct in its criticisms. It wrote, quote, the proposal is a radical policy change in our view. It is excessive in scope, effect, and purpose, end quote. The The Canadian Civil Liberties Association even explained why it thinks the government is pushing this dangerous agenda. Quote, "We recognize the public pressure on governments to do something about the Wild West of online content. With this proposal, however, the Heritage Ministry is addressing areas far outside its core expertise. It ought not to be stewarding legislation that so impacts Canada's foreign affairs, anti-terrorism, and criminal laws. Consulting with other ministries and other jurisdictions and stakeholders will not suffice, any more than one would want foreign affairs to regulate the radio broadcast industry. This may explain the proposal's overall breadth." End of quote. In their submission to the government, the Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic point out the government's plan would hurt the very groups they claim they want to protect. Quote, "In this context, the government's proposed legislation to regulate online harms seriously undermines claims that Canada is a leader in human rights. By raising the specter of content filtering and website blocking, the current proposal threatens fundamental freedoms and the survival of a free and open internet in Canada and beyond. In an effort to combat hate speech and other ills, the proposed law threatens the free expression and privacy rights of the very equality-seeking communities that it seeks to protect." End of quote. Citizen Lab is an interdisciplinary laboratory run by the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. The lab focuses on research, development, policy and legal issues related to information and communication technologies, human rights, and global security. An online harms bill is right up this group's alley. Rather than quote from their submission, I'm going to just read to you their table of contents. Quote, Chapter 1. This consultation is inadequate. Chapter 2. The proposed regime will not achieve its intended goals. Chapter 3. The scope of the proposal is overbroad and incoherent. Chapter 4. Automated enforcement exacerbates pre-existing problems. Chapter 5. Unidirectional takedown incentive will likely be inequitable and unconstitutional. Chapter 6. Surveillance and mandatory reporting requirements are dangerous and chilling. Chapter 7. New CSIS powers are unjustified and inappropriately included in this consultation. And Chapter 8. Conclusion. Rewrite the proposal from the ground up. End quote. Much like the research laboratories, the Global Network Initiative tries to take a respectful tone. Quote, while we appreciate the public policy rationale for addressing online harms, we're concerned that some aspects of the proposed approach appear to be inconsistent with international human rights principles, regulatory best practice, and Canada's leadership on international internet freedom. End quote. The Independent Press Gallery of Canada, representing media not beholden to the Liberal government, wrote, quote, the proposal has significant legal issues throughout and harmful legal consequences to charter-protected freedoms and the rule of law. End quote. The International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group is a coalition of 45 civil society organizations from a range of backgrounds and sectors from across Canada, including leading faith-based labor, human rights, refugee and migrant, and environmental groups. Established in 2002,
Its mandate is to ensure the protection of civil liberties in Canada in the context of anti-terrorism and national security laws and activities. They wrote, quote, "We see several worrisome and even troubling aspects to this current proposal that may, in fact, undermine the stated goals. These include the further expansion of problematic definitions of terrorism and enforcement online, which have been shown to more often target the very communities which the government proposes to support with this new regime. A questionable conflation of efforts to address wildly different harms which need very specific solutions. A monitoring and removal process that threatens freedom of expression and privacy rights, which will likely have a severe and significant impact on already marginalized communities. New obligatory reporting rules to law enforcement and intelligence agencies. New warrant powers for CSIS. Transparency and accountability requirements that require the addition of more robust policies, end quote. Internet Archive Canada is a not-for-profit digital library whose mission is to provide universal access to all knowledge. They wrote about how the law could actually empower Facebook at the expense of libraries and archives. Quote, "While this proposal appears centered around large social media platforms, we have deep concerns about it, including its potential for broad application to libraries and small, not-for-profit organizations like ours. We believe that libraries and others like us have a role to play in creating and sustaining a better internet with more digital public spaces and more access to good and trustworthy information online. Unfortunately, imposing newly burdensome and potentially overbroad regulatory regimes, even with the best of intentions, is likely to make the costs of participation in certain digital spaces too high for all but the largest commercial actors. The result will be further entrenchment of the largest foreign corporations in positions of dominance online. Should the government proceed with its proposal, it should carefully consider the extent to which it will make it even more difficult for truly Canadian spaces to survive and thrive online, leaving us with a worse information ecosystem overall." End quote. The Internet Society Canada chapter ISCC is a not-for-profit corporation that engages on internet legal and policy issues to advocate for an open, accessible, and affordable internet for Canadians. They share many of the same concerns as other organizations, but first issue with government consultation with themselves. Here's what they wrote, quote, "ISCC would like to register its profound disappointment with this ostensible consultative process. First, it is taking place during an electoral period, despite the fact that its subject matter is composed of parts of partisan platforms. This suggests that it is inappropriate to be consulting when at least one of the parties, if successful in forming a government, has a preempted, genuine consideration of meaningful suggestions for change." End quote. In a joint submission from civil liberties organizations and leftist anti-racism groups, they reiterate what we have heard from other groups. Quote, "While the proposal is billed as protecting marginalized groups from hate, harassment, and violent rhetoric online, we fear that, as currently formulated, it risks exacerbating the existing, well-documented pattern of online speech policing and removal targeting Indigenous, Black, Palestinian, and other colonized and racialized communities, end quote. Many of those leftist and anti-racism groups will dislike learning they're on the same side as myself, but this is the point I made when I denounced C10. Governments don't censor popular majority speech. They always go after minority speech. The Public Interest Advocacy Center is a national, non-for-profit organization and registered charity that provides legal and research services on behalf of consumer interests, and in particular, vulnerable consumer interests concerning the provision of important public services. They go into great detail about the legal and technological challenges with the government's proposal to block websites. Quote, "We ask that in considering whether and how to implement such a regime, that the government consider the broader implications on Canada's net neutrality framework, including the effects on competition, innovation, consumer choice, access and affordability, privacy, and Canadians' right to freedom of expression," end quote. The organization Open Media is rather blunt in its submission, quote, "In our response, we explain how this dangerously misguided approach could make our internet among the most censored and surveilled in the world. Informed by expert analysis and the voices of our community, we describe how it will lead directly to the removal of many lawful online posts in Canada, including important forms of protest and personal expression, a surveillance system of lawful speech on social media unprecedented in the democratic world, and direct silencing and over-policing of marginalized communities and voices," end quote. Ranking Digital Rights is an organization which ranks different governments on their commitment to upholding our human rights in the digital space. They wrote, quote, "Like many other well-intentioned policy solutions, the government's proposal falls into the trap of focusing exclusively on the moderation of user-generated content while ignoring the economic factors that drive platform design and corporate decision-making," end quote. Along with these many organizations, individuals have written to the government with the same concerns. As I mentioned at the top, I wanted to go through all those quotes so you can really appreciate how widespread opposition to the Liberals' censorship plan is. These are not fringe organizations. Now, with so much widespread mainstream opposition to the Trudeau Liberals' radical plan to censor the internet, you would think it might be big news. Except there's one group that supports the Liberals' plans to censor the internet. That group is the liberal media. Not every individual member of the media supports the Liberal plan to censor the internet, but all their bosses do. News Media Canada is the lobby group which secured $600 million of your tax dollars to go to dying newspapers. Here's what News Media Canada wrote in their submission, quote, "As a business, the news publishing industry remains under threat from the unregulated and unchecked social media and other online communication service providers," end quote. Well, you've heard it directly from the horse's mouths. The key part of that quote is "as a business." This is not about online harms. This is about using the excuse of online harms to regulate a competing business. Recently, CBC announced it was joining with the newspaper lobbyists to, quote, "advocate for initiatives to reduce, if not prevent, online harm," end quote. the CBC is finally admitting it's not in the business of reporting news, but advocating for causes. Which brings us to today. On the one side, you have every credible expert and organization saying the government needs to go back to the drawing board because what it is proposing is extreme and undemocratic. On the other side is the government and the self-declared mainstream media. The liberal media cannot be trusted to report honestly about the online harms bill. They've openly declared a side and declared they will act as advocates for their side. The liberal attempt to censor the internet will be the biggest fight in the upcoming parliament. We need every tool and will need to use every tool to stop this. We'll be starting petitions, letter writing campaigns, and speaking out every chance we get in Parliament. You can help us support this fight right now by liking and sharing this video. Because if you do not share this news, who will? Live from Ottawa, this is Cheryl Gallant, wishing you a good night.